Hi, guys. What we're looking at this week and we kind of want to overview and sum up as best we can the Civil War, um, which is a tough task to do in the short time that we have in what is very much one of the, if not the most important event in American history. As you guys know, based on our previous discussions, as you get into 1860, the new Republican Party has taken their candidate, the relatively unknown Abraham Lincoln, and moved him forward for the presidency. And receiving no votes in the South, Lincoln gets a majority in the Electoral College and wins the 1860 presidential election. To the South, this is seen as a final straw. Lincoln at this moment is not an abolitionist. The very pragmatic Lincoln wants to stop the extension of slavery into the Western territories, which then eventually slavery would die out on its own. That's his thesis. The South, seeing this, it becomes the catalyst for the secession of Southern states. And very rapidly after Lincoln's election, Southern states start to secede. Lincoln then is, once he's sworn into office, has a divided nation. And the Constitution is very, very vague regarding what powers does a president have militarily within the borders of the United States. Constitutionally, the president has quite a bit of leeway outside the borders of the United States. Eventually, this problem is solved in many ways by the Confederacy. There is a federal U.S. series of forts, but Fort Sumter off the key coast of Charleston, South Carolina, and eventually the Confederates attack that fort, which is really the first fighting of the Civil War. And then that becomes the catalyst for Lincoln being able to justify constitutionally protecting the interest of the United States. But you run into a really interesting situation as both sides begin to prepare for the war. Even though the United States was rapidly becoming an economic power, not just regionally, but around the world, really our military was nowhere. Obviously, you think about the United States as a military power today, but back then it really wasn't. So the Union, the United States, has to expand its military. It has to expand the total number of troops. It has to shift industrial production. And the South really doesn't have a military. So as we get into this, we kind of look at where both sides were. Now, the North had quite a bit of strengths industrially in that. And, this is the technology and this is the mode of transportation. But if you notice how much, more than twice as much railroad as the South did. And the railroad allows you to move products, services, you could move troops, you can move supplies for troops very easily. And it's by no coincidence that most of the major battles of the Civil War, I should say many of the major battles of the Civil War, are fought along some type of transportation lines, whether they be river landings or railroad crossings. The North also has the industrial United States in the 1860s is the North. The South had become so dependent on King Cotton, they were very agriculturally based and therefore did not have a diverse economy. So the North had more factories. Thus, it was easier for the North to transfer over and begin war production, whether it be cannons, saddles, whatever the implements of war were and are. The North had the factory capacity and ability to create those products. And the other thing, and this just gets into, and it eventually takes Ulysses S. Grant, and I think Lincoln also knew this from the beginning. The math of the Civil War comes into play in that 2/3 of the nation's population lived in Union or Northern states, which allows for a larger military, yet it allows for people to continue to work in the factories to produce the implements of war, and you still have hands in the field to produce the food not only for the Northern Army, but also for the populace. So just the math of the population becomes a key strength for the North at the outset of the Civil War. Now, with that said, as you look, the South had advantages as well. Now, if you were, you know, putting odds in Vegas, I think you would call these intangibles, and sometimes intangibles are difficult to quantify. Most of the military colleges in the United States were in the South. Okay, and there was a strong, you know, Washington was from Virginia. Many of our founding fathers and military leaders were from the South. Okay, so most of the trained, experienced officers in the United States military in the 1860s were actually from the South. The other thing is, the South's not trying to force slavery upon the entirety of the United States of America. The South just wants to be left alone. So, in many ways, the South only has to fight a defensive war. It's not a war of invasion where they're trying to get the North to change. They just want to be, in their words, be left alone. I find it interesting. I put these two pictures on the right, and I purposely took a picture of the younger Robert E. Lee. This is Robert E. Lee in the 1850s, and he was the bright star of the United States military. By his early 40s, you know, Robert E. Lee had already been the superintendent of West Point. He had commands in the war with Mexico. It was, interestingly enough, it was Lee who put down the John Brown's attempted slave insurrection in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And in fact, most experts believe that the best person to lead the Union Army during the Civil War would have been Robert E. Lee. Another example is Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was a graduate of West Point, an experienced officer in the war in Mexico, who had served in the United States military. Davis was also the Secretary of War of the United States of America. So I think it gives you an idea of the type of military leadership that the South had at its disposal. Okay. And finally, for what this is worth, and this is one's tough, many Southerners felt that they were adhering to the norms of the American Revolution, that they were fighting for self-control and states' rights. Now, we have to be 100% honest. One of the state rights that they were holding on to most dearly was that sad state right of slavery, and the economic advantages it gave the South, obviously. But those were the intangible strengths that the South brought to the table for the Civil War. Now, the Union and Lincoln, and this is tough, the Union and Lincoln, understanding their advantages regarding resources and some of the economic disadvantages that the South had, proposed an idea of what they called the Anaconda Plan. And their hope was to choke off the South. And so the idea was to attempt to blockade all the major ports of the South, and that way no supplies could come in from Europe, and probably more importantly, no cotton could go out. You know, that cotton was really, if you will, the white dollar of the South. That was in many ways their money, because it was so sought after on the world market. Okay, so that's part two. And then the Union then wanted to then try to cut off the Mississippi River. So that's the idea of the Anaconda Plan, to choke out the South and limit their resources. Okay. Now, this is tough, though. Just a broad understanding of U.S. geography. I think you guys understand that this is a vast amount of coastline to try to patrol. So it would be almost impossible to completely cut that off. So the Anaconda Plan, which is a good idea, and in many ways, if you look at how the Civil War ended, the Anaconda Plan is how the war ended is a rough sketch of the Anaconda Plan. But this is tough to pull off. This is tough to pull off. Now, the South's goal was to fight a defensive war, and I would call it an aggressive defensive war. So if you look in this this area here, this green, is the Confederate States, and they just want to kind of defend their territory. And every now and then they'll be aggressive and they'll push into areas to try to push back the Army, the Union, the U.S. Army. Okay. Um, the South's plan, and ladies and gentlemen, the first almost 3 years of the Civil War, the South wins almost every major altercation, and they're inflicting great casualties upon the North. So part of their goal is to inflict enough casualties on the North where the North and the citizens of the United States, remember we're a democracy, finally tell the leaders, hey, we're done. This isn't worth it. The New York Times, major newspapers across the North would list in very small print after major battles. They would put the names of all the dead and in frighteningly small print. And you'd open up the paper and it would just be, and think about how big old newspapers used to be, and it would just be all these names and at major battles. And it seemed like there was a time period there where um, the South was winning every major battle. Okay. They also hoped, the South hoped, as part of their strategy, was that their cotton was so important to France and Great Britain that those nations would actually support them financially. And it's kind of sad. Britain plays around with supporting um, the Confederacy a little bit during the Civil War, but ultimately um, they don't, because if you support the Confederacy, you're indirectly and in many ways directly supporting the institution of slavery. And in fact, both France and Great Britain turned to other places, specifically like Egypt, to get their cotton, Egypt and India to get their cotton. So that card that the South tries to play um, doesn't work out. Um, this is one of those sad moments. By the time you get to the 1860s in the United States of America, we have industrialized it. Technology is moving rapidly by the standards of that time period. And so our ability to more efficiently kill and then to mass produce those implements of destruction um, improves rapidly. You know, at the start of the Civil War, most guys are using single shot rifles. Well, by the end of the Civil War, you have lever action rifles that can get 7 rounds off. You start to get into the Gatling gun. Cannons and munitions improve. Sadly, though, generalship and military leadership doesn't improve. So, as these implements of war are getting better and more destructive and more effective, we're kind of using that same, hey, let's march in a straight line at our enemy, you know? Um, and so you have what are staggering totals of those killed to this day. And you guys can see based on the graphic that I've given you, to this day, the bloodiest war in American history is the Civil War. I mean, a couple of these numbers are dated, but I mean, you can almost, and I'm doing rough math here, but if you were to add up World War II, World War I, Vietnam, Korea, the Revolutionary War, and the wars against terror, you know, those, you add those up and they're roughly the same number as those killed during the Civil War. Also, if you were to extrapolate the, if you were to compare, if the same percentage of the American population died in a war today as during the Civil War, that would be the equivalent of 6 million. I mean, think about a war where we would have lost 6 million, or um, of the American people. So it's bloody. It is America's bloody war, and I hope, in many ways, I hope that continues to be the case. But the Civil War is bloody. Now you also have to keep in mind that we're taking casualties from both sides. We're counting both the Union and the Confederates as they were Americans, because it is a Civil War, but a frighteningly bloody war in American history. The other thing I want you to see, and you can dig around and do some research on your own, but it is also there were battles fought. I mean, you get into the North where there are battles fought. Obviously, the most famous battle of the Civil War, Gettysburg, is fought in the northern state of Pennsylvania. Um, There were battles fought, obviously, across the South. If you were to move this map forward, there were altercations as far west as present day Arizona. It encompasses much of the United States of America. This was now most of the fighting, the vast majority of the fighting is kind of concentrated in parts of Virginia and Maryland. Okay. But there are major battles throughout the entirety of the United States. Of those, and we'll use this as a transition point, but of those um, battles, there's this time period in early July 1863 that turns the tide of the war. I would argue that, and I wouldn't say winning, I don't know if that's the right word, but the momentum of the war in summer of 1863 is firmly with the South. Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia seems almost unbeatable. Um, the Union in the Western theater, so picture, if you will, places like Tennessee and Mississippi, the Union Army is making advances in that region, but much of the much of the momentum of the war is with the South, and we're also coming up close to an election year by 1863. 1864 was an election year, um, and so Lincoln is very worried that the American people aren't going to reelect him, and candidates that run against him actually run on a platform of, if you vote for me, I'll end this war. Okay, so that's where we're at. But we have a shift during July of 1863 with the battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, which turned the tide of the war, and I would argue shift the momentum, and in fact make it almost inevitable that the Union, the North, is going to win the Civil War. Okay, so we're going to use that as our transition, and we'll get into that, the impact of these two major battles, in our next summary. Okay, thanks, guys.